Sonia.
Thank you. Sophia, thank you, and thank you to everyone for inviting me to speak and for still being here at the end of a very lively 2 days. So if I speak at this volume, is that cool at the back? Microphone not on? Okay, if I speak now, is that good? Okay, I'll say thank you again. Yeah, so when Jane first asked me to come and talk about my work, I thought it felt quite a long way away from the subject of the conference, and I wasn't sure I had things to say about YouTube, and then I began thinking about the book that I've just published, and we'll see. The lives of children, I want to argue, are both closely entwined with YouTube and also in various ways kind of curiously distant. So I'm going to start somewhere else. I'm going to start with the lives of a class of children, and I'm going to show you where YouTube, as it were, fits in and comes in and out of focus in their lives, sometimes seemingly distant, sometimes really important. So the class, which is just out, is I've put up the URL of the free to read, just not to sell anything, but to say it is free to read online. Is a study of an ordinary class of London kids aged 13 to 14. And in this talk, I want to talk about what are the kind of meanings and practices and contexts of their lives in terms of media, and then think particularly where YouTube fits in. So I could start, and people often do start, with the kind of statistics that say YouTube is children and young people's number one go-to thing to do on the internet. It's their most used site, it's where they spend the most time. If you look at the stats, you'd kind of get the impression that they're all, there's something homogenous about their experience, and of course that's the consequence of looking at very kind of simple statistics. You can see immediately that they're commercially valuable. You can see immediately that YouTube appeals across gender and age, but it tells us very little about the meaning and practices of the ways in which they might be engaging with it. So in my work, I've always started somewhere else. I just thought I'd put up some titles of the kinds of sources that I've found influential and the kind of books that capture to me, even in their very titles, the ways in which our lives are mediated without necessarily becoming media-centric. And I suppose my kind of broader question is really when and in what ways are media coming to underpin all kinds of practices and opportunities and pleasures and problems in our lives. And I think I love all these titles about mediation and mediating, because they've kind of moved us from a world of the media and the family as it goes on in its unchanged way, or school life, or work life, or political life. Rather than, as it were, the media being an addition to all these different spheres of everyday lives, I'm interested in the ways in which the media are kind of permeating through them and in various ways kind of potentially or actually changing what it means to be a child, what it is to learn at school, what the nature of family life is, and so forth. And the other thing that I see the notion of mediation doing, and a lot of these kind of studies that begin with everyday life and kind of ask where the media are fitting into that, is that they are all, I think, struggling to bring together the very material nature of the media and in their kind of technological and commercial and very kind of concrete forms with the more elusive semiotic nature of the meanings. And as someone who has spent a lot of time being an audience researcher, what we can see through the history of audience research is that audiences both do diverse and sometimes unexpected things with media in their material dimension, and even more so, they interpret the media and the possibilities of media forms and genres in ways that are not always predictable and expected. So in the class, we kind of tried to start with a class of regular kids and see what their lives were like, and then think, what are the ways in which these different material and semiotic forms are coming into their lives, and what could the potential be? And the project was funded by the MacArthur Foundation's Digital Media Learning Initiative, which is quite a kind of idealistic educational effort, largely in the United States. And I just put up some of the kinds of things that the Digital Media Learning Initiative is doing right now. This is on the website just now. It's a constantly changing array of efforts to find ways to make media do more for young people, build more constructive pathways, more creative possibilities, more or reinvigorated or inspiring kinds of learning, collaboration, participation, expression, and so forth. So while the work I want to talk to you about is kind of very grounded and concrete, there is this kind of question in the air: how could it be different? How could it be better? What do we hope for a class of 13 to 14-year-olds, or indeed for any young people? And central to the my work falls within a particular part of the Digital Media Learning Initiative, which is working with the notion of connected learning. And the idea that somehow the digital media, which are all about connections and networks, could be, or maybe already are, connecting the sites of young people's lives in order to enable their opportunities for learning and participation. And that if the different kind of physical spaces can be kind of digitally mediated and better connected, then perhaps what it is that young people themselves want to do, their agency, their interests, their motivations, can be kind of enabled and brought more clearly to fruition than they often are at present. So, behind, deliberate as it were, behind my research questions is a picture of a pretty kind of ordinary school. I can't ever say anything is typical because schools, young people's lives vary. That's in a way my kind of key point, but this is a not unusual or distinctive secondary school in a London suburb, rather kind of ethnically mixed, socio-economically mixed, and the project, which was centred around one class there, asked how children's digital media activities are embedded in their daily practices and regimes of learning and leisure. Whether, and it's possible that the answer is no, whether the digital in some ways does enable new kinds of opportunities in their lives. And then the normative question, whether it does or doesn't, how could it be, what could be better enhanced by the activities of the peers, the school, the family, and the community, and so forth, which sit around. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of how we did the research, and my co-author, whose name was on the front cover of the book, Julian Sefton-Green, is a media educator, and we did a kind of pairing in the project where I've spent more time working with children and families at home, thinking about the way in which the home is becoming mediated. He spent more time working in schools, thinking about how schools are becoming kind of more digitally mediated, and of course children's lives bring the two. There are distinctions between home and school, but their lives are a whole. So I've heard a fair bit in this conference about the effort to kind of grasp the global connectivity of YouTube and its many connections across people's communicative possibilities, different kinds of texts globally. I'm going to bring you to a very, very local site, which is what we have to do when we want to study people's lives in depth. So this is a a representation of a space that you can walk across in about 45 minutes. And it's a kind of classic, here we are in the land of social class. It's a classic locale in that it has a railway line which divides the relatively privileged from the relatively less privileged. And the school is a little house shape and the kids live around. And I show you this to say that children are already connected. I mean, it's an odd sense in a way to ask questions about how digital media can connect children because their lives are already connected. And yet what we know of the trends of children's lives over the last few decades is increasingly adults are worried about allowing them to explore those connections among themselves because streets have become very dangerous and everyone's become very risk averse. In London, and I think in a number of really cosmopolitan cities, they're not everywhere, it is possible, and it was the case in this class, to be simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, in the sense that I do think it's not atypical, and yet we had the refugee child sitting next to the child of someone whose house was worth several million, and there is a kind of extraordinary concatenation of difference sitting there in the classroom. And I want to kind of start with say something about how it is that mediation enables and builds connections and commonalities among people that allows that kind of difference to become less problematic. The research was ethnographic, as I've said, and we spent about 15 months, the two of us, with this class of 28 kids, so it was intensive and it was a significant part of my life as well as their lives. And we kind of phased the work to follow the kids, beginning by getting to know them after a planning phase in the school, sitting in classrooms, just listening out when a media mentioned, which media are mentioned, how might they come in, when they're not relevant, in the school, in the classroom, in the playground, in the lunch, and so on, walking home to and from school, always an important part of children's lives. The second phase, once we got to know them, we felt we could ask permission and we went into the homes, talked to the children there, met their families, met their siblings, met their pets. Kids are very keen always to introduce you to their cats and tortoises and so forth. Having kind of built up a relationship with them at that point, also went online with them and looked at the things that they did online. And insofar as we could, at a kind of later phase, we also did some spending time with them in groups, going to music lessons or football on Saturdays or whatever the kind of informal settings were, and kind of infusing all of that in a kind of faint cloud that I put around is the digital, or at least the question of the digital, and when does it come in? So when Jane said come and talk about YouTube in the class, I went back to all the coded interviews and field notes that we'd done and typed YouTube into, actually we'd already coded YouTube in NVivo, and found 88 mentions of YouTube from a year's field work, so I thought, okay, there's something going on there. And of course many more ways in which the young people talked about video or watching things on the internet, or so many more oblique references as well. But I'm going to try and give you a sense of what it was, where it is, as it were, that something like YouTube came into their lives. So I'll begin in the class because that's where we began, and it's the first place where we encountered YouTube and media in their lives, and I've put a lot of images up. I just want to explain. Perhaps the key thing to notice is that many British schools now have a large screen at the front and that screen is described as the interactive whiteboard or the smart board, and I very rarely saw it being interactive or smart. It's very largely used as a one-way mass communication, and YouTube was also the teacher's go-to source of material to show the news in the morning, to get the kids kind of talking about the week ahead, or to show a film to illustrate a point in geography, or we sat through a kind of series of lessons in which they were using roots to tell the history of slavery in America, and so forth. Chariots of Fire figured at one point in order to get everyone to learn the theme music in music technology. There was a whole host of ways in which mass culture was kind of broadcast at the kids as part of lessons, as part of an educational setup. It won't escape you that this is not the latest, the edgiest, or the most topical forms of communication available on YouTube or indeed on mainstream. These were, as it were, what it is that the teachers had got used to and accommodated to using in their classrooms because they've been using it for years and they've got lesson plans around it, and probably they were more the media of their youth than they were of the children's youth. It was not, as it were, interest-driven, child-motivated, but there was quite a lot of media there. And I've kind of put that on the right, and we did a lot of thinking about that in relation to what we saw everywhere around the school, which is typified by the image on the left, which was to realise that the contemporary secondary school is a place of individual competition and achievement. And there was a whole kind of host of explicit and implicit exhortations to children to raise their level and achieve. And indeed the English curriculum at that point was precisely coded in terms of very precise levels. So as we discovered somewhat to our dismay, we could say to a child in the class, "How's your maths?" And they'd say, "Well, I'm at a level 5C and I hope to become 6A by the end of term." And we'd say, and we were expecting, "How's your maths?" "Well, I'm learning trigonometry," or "I struggle with long division." But no, there was a kind of talk in a coded language of standardized achievement. And at the same time, and this is my kind of point about the mass media, at the same time the media were being used to create a kind of common and shared discourse that brought everyone together, despite, as I showed you, the very considerable cultural diversity that had led the children into that one classroom. And I might illustrate that kind of effort to use the media for to create a kind of commonality. We thought of it as a civility, really, a way of getting on with the fact that the person next to you comes from a very different background. We thought of this very kind of evidently in the series of lessons that used roots to